Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Magazine podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of the magazine, and with me is the almost usual team today. We have Mark DeSantis, Murray Dahm, Mark McCaffrey, Lindsay Powell, and special guest Joe Ball. Welcome, everyone. We're not discussing a latest issue of the magazine today, so we have an in-betweener, as we call them, and we thought today we would, over the last couple of weeks, most of us have watched the new show Barbarians, and we thought we'd discuss it. That means that there has to be a spoiler warning, so be warned, there are going to be spoilers very probably. But to spoil the story, the actual story, I would ask Lindsay to introduce the dramatis personae, as we said before we started the show, to us, so that we sort of are all refreshed on what the actual story is and what we know about the people who are featured in it.
Well, thank you for that. It's an interesting introduction there. Yes, but that means I'm the spoil sport. That's great.
Well, but we know the history.
Yeah, I know. So I was going to start with this famous quote: "Quintilivare legiones rede, quintilis varus, give me back my allegiance." That's got to be a great sort of campaign slogan, hasn't it? So what do we got? We've got a very, very infamous event in Roman history. Of course, if you are a German around about the sort of 1800s, 1900s, in fact, this is actually a great source of inspiration. So you've got a story of goodies and baddies, effectively, and it's a question of which side you're on that determines whether you think the one guy's good or bad. Arch villain of the story, of course, is really Arminius, who is a war chief of the Cherusci nation. A tribe which is presumably somewhere in that what we now consider to be the Hanover area, and the historic character is really documented in a number of Roman sources, and that gives me an opportunity to digress a couple of minutes on the sources. Where do we get what we know about these events in the first place? Well, there are really only four, and they're spread out in time. So you've got, for example, Velius Paterculus, who in time is actually closest to the events, and you could actually say is maybe even known to some of the protagonists. So his source should theoretically be quite reliable. And what's very interesting is that he brings a certain narrative to the story, and it's slightly different than the other ones. Then there's also Tacitus, who, of course, is writing about 50 to 60 years later. And you learn about the battle, really, because he's talking about the activities of Germanicus, and you see the Battle of Teutoburg really through the person going back. And as somebody said in the chat before we went live, maybe there's a series 2, maybe there's actually a series of the Roman comeback, Empire Strikes Back, you might say. There's another historian, Florus, who writes around about the time of Hadrian, and there are some interesting kind of little historical digressions in his account. But actually the most consistent and complete story that we have from the ancient world is probably Cassius Dio. And from him, you actually learn probably most about the characters. You learn most about the unfolding events. The fact that it is not one event, it's actually a series, probably over 3 or 4 days. And it's really the totality of this layer cake of sources that screenwriters and historians like myself try to reconstruct the narrative of this battle or campaign, because I think part of the mistake here is that people think of it as being one battle. In fact, it's not. It's a number of days which constitute a battle. So I talked about Arminius. Arminius is really considered to be the arch villain here. Germans often will refer to him as Hermann the German here in, for example, a place like Minnesota. His historic background to this, probably born around about 18 BC, goes on to live through to about 20 AD. So he actually lives a reasonable number of years. Cherusci, as I say, it turns out that he is actually at a very young age handed over by his father, Zegimir, or Zegimirus, as a hostage when that man negotiates a treaty with Tiberius around about, I think it's 7 BC, something like that. And in fact, he grows up for his early years and into his teenage years in Rome. So he's a little unusual as a barbarian in the sense that he's actually brought up really surrounded by Roman values, and the hope is, in often is the case, is that he'll be shipped back to his country with a backbone of Roman values and will actually help hammer the barbarians into shape. So there's an interesting kind of issue there, and the background to the story is, and the thing that historians try to wrestle with is, having had that kind of background, why does he in AD 9 suddenly transform into this nationalistic sort of German character who forms an alliance against the Romans. On his family, you've got, I think I mentioned Zegimir, who is the father. There is if I've got this right, there's a sort of a little dramatic twist because he finds out about the plot, tries to tell the Romans about this, and he's not believed. There's Segestes, who is the father of Tusnelda, who is the wife of Arminius. The plot and the character set grows here. So there's an interesting character set on the German side. Of course, on the opposite Roman side, you've got the infamous character of Publius Quinctilius Varus, who is really, depending on the sources, a character who is maligned or very maligned. He doesn't come out very well in the Roman sources. And what's interesting, I mentioned earlier about the source of Velleius Paterculus. Velleius Paterculus really blames this guy, and actually the people who chose that guy. He sees him as an inexperienced commander, which is really interesting because, in fact, he shouldn't have been an inexperienced commander. He actually had seen action in the Alpine War in 15 BC with Tiberius and Nero Claudius Drusus. He suppressed a revolt in Syria, where he was the governor, and also saw service in Africa. So when he was appointed by Augustus to Germania, this man has a slate of experience in battle orders. So the interesting dramatic question is, how did the guy screw up so badly, really? And I suppose that's where a drama like Barbarian probably opens up the possibilities. And there are other Roman characters who play bit parts. But effectively, you've got Varus, Arminius as the two protagonists and antagonists, and various people. And I come back to the basic issue of the story is really made up of a layer cake of different sources. We know a great deal about what we don't know. We actually don't know that much. For example, we don't know really where it took place. I've estimated there are something like 700 places where it could have taken place, according to different people. Kalkriese in Germany is a front-running candidate, but there are questions. We know it was in AD 9, but which month? We don't quite know. We think it's probably the late summer, so it could be late August, September, could even be October, possibly. And the basic question for a drama is, why did he do it? The motive is not really very clear in the Roman sources. They sort of ascribe issues like, well, the sort of the cruelty in the way that the Romans were treating the Germans, and this was very offensive to Arminius, and therefore he comes to the table with this nationalistic revolt. And I think that's a place to hand over the discussion to the rest of the panel.
Yes. And where shall we start? I'm sure there's a lot to discuss. We can talk about the story that's represented, or how the Romans are seen, or the Germans are seen. We can talk about the fact that one side speaks Latin of some kind, the other side speaks modern German. I'm not sure if it would have been possible to speak ancient German for a whole show. Who wants to? Let's talk about what it looks like, because that's what everybody immediately responded to when we said we were going to talk to. What does it look like?
I've run out of fingers to keep the points I want to make, so I don't have enough fingers and toes, which is interesting. I think that the thing for me was that there was a combination of nice, authentic touches or attempts. I mean, the Latin itself is a lovely attempt that we don't tend to get. Obviously, we had the Mel Gibson film where they spoke Aramaic and things like that, so it's been done. But then at the same time as those interesting touches, there are things that are tropes in ancient film, both on the barbarian side and the Roman side, that this just buys into, and then all the way through to fantastical fantasy made up stuff that looks cool. And in addition, there are also bits within it that are 2020 last 5 years of television, the very bloodiness of it, some of the sort of the looks of the characters in terms of the face paint, which has a birth in reality, but how far they've taken it is far beyond what we know. And so it's basically a mishmash of all of that in terms of the look, I think, which is frustrating to see those things combined without any real differentiation between this is the bit we know and this is the bit we don't.
think we went into it as, knowing our history with all expectations and whatnot. And I think, like you're saying, some things lived up to them. But on the other hand, I mean, I think one of the main things, not to give out, too many spoilers there, but, when it culminated in the battle, as Lindsay was saying, this is actually more of a campaign than a single battle. And yet the series sort of culminated in the final episode, giving one single battle that lasted, I believe it's 10 minutes in length, and literally, I mean, if you know the campaign, part of it is Arminius is, he's got this great background of having been trained and a seasoned campaigner in Roman tactics and whatnot, and it sort of builds it up to, along those lines in the series. But ultimately, you're left sort of wondering, where exactly was the great Roman strategist in the end, because it ends up being just again another barbarian charge. And yes, there's a little bit of breaking up the Roman legion by some fire tricks, and there's also a stop laughing, Lindsay.
Fire trick sounds like a female character.
Sorry, okay. Well, there is also the attack on the the Roman line, and they're saying the Roman line is spread out. We're going to hit it in multiple places, but ultimately, if you read the sources, of course, some of the great things in the sources are the descriptions of Arminius having prepared all of these fortification works along a predisposed line of what he anticipated the Romans would take as a exit strategy from the situation, and actually anticipating all their moves. And of course, whereas historians are thinking we're really excited about seeing this, it doesn't happen. So
that's a real shame.
A bit of letdown.
I mean, okay, I'm not a screenplay writer. I'm a non-fiction historian, right? But it just seems to be that I was writing the book for Osprey, trying to explain this in the context of the whole campaign going through Germanicus, and really it just struck me a battle or a campaign over 4 days, and the way that the Germans grind them down and they pull back and forth. And they really know how to defeat this professional army, and I thought that's a wonderful. If that could be depicted, I mean, it would be a study in military leadership. It sounds like they blew it.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's such a shame as well, because it's such a well thought out Germanic plan, and we see kind of in the archaeology, we see how much they had ground down the Romans by the time they're getting to the end stages of the battle, if we are right, and we're seeing it. You see even in the artifacts that are missing from the site. So this is the only Roman battlefield that's been discovered really where there are very few hobnails on the site, where we would expect there to be hundreds, thousands of these things compared to other battlefields. So this almost suggests that by this point the Romans have they're down to even their shoes haven't got hobnails in anymore. They're completely ground down by this sort of ongoing attack over the 4 days of sleepless nights and dragging themselves through the German forest. And the series just sort of shows it, as we say, as this 10-minute battle.
The shame is that there was a very famous American movie set in Vietnam, wasn't there? It almost takes you into the realm of a sort of psychedelic derangement, because I mean, the people have been ground down, and eventually they are left with nothing, just their humanity. And I would imagine it's a shame they didn't do that. And if they, how many episodes is this thing?
6 episodes.
6.
Well, they had plenty of time to tell the story properly, didn't they?
Oh yeah.
Well, I think the problem also is that idea that we do have historical characters and their characters are developed, but as Mark pointed out, the battle itself, the culmination of the whole series is 10 minutes in the last episode. So you've had 4 hours and 30 minutes build up, and then a 10-minute battle, and then in the last seconds we get the set up for a sequel as Varus's decapitated head. Oh, spoiler! Is ridden off somewhere. So it's a particularly peculiar one. But then again, all of that talk about tactics, we did have very briefly a single line depth Roman shield wall that got broken when they attacked the main legions again, there's no sense of tactics. They break down into the traditional one-on-one melee with no sense of strategy, no sense of tactics, other than a variegated line of fire, which might have been the makers going, this is our prepared siege works or our prepared vellum, is actually a trench of burning oil. But again, the trope of you can't have a battle scene without fire. And there were no explosions. No one was.
I did do your bingo, and I got a bingo.
You must have got absolutely plastered within the first few minutes. But I don't play my bingo these days because you get. It's funny though because there's so many access points. I mean, obviously, from a Roman perspective, the most obvious one is that the Romans wear segmented armor, and they have square rectangular shields, which is of course not quite the right equipment for AD 9.
I actually should mention this. Cesare Wyszynski is a Roman reenactor I've known for a long time from Roman Army Talk, and he's been at least the costume advisor for this series. And I talked to him a little bit, and I think he did a great job. He got the Romans looking really good, but for about 50 years later, and he admits that that may have been a question of budget. Where can you get all this stuff for so many people? Maybe getting several hundred sets of mail and slightly unusual helmets, other than the standard Imperial Gallic was a problem. I don't know. It's
well, I certainly don't underestimate the challenge. And I mean,
it's a big challenge. And the Roman they looked good.
Yeah. Well, for the longest time, I mean, there was basically like a costume rental company in Rome, wasn't it? And every sort of
no one wore.
Every company went and rented the same stuff. And in fact, what happened after Gladiator, you'd see the same sort of black Praetorian armor would recycle between different movies and things.
No one was wearing leather, Lorica Segmentata, at least in this one. So
but on the other hand, we didn't see that much of the Roman army in terms of it was all very, just the legion, just the legionaries. You didn't actually, and even when they sort of went into the camp, so that bothered me because for some reason they had a T-shaped camp.
I pushed that way down.
They had an entrance way into the bottom of the T. Anyway, when they went into the camp, there was very little in terms of the details of the different aspects of an army. In terms of you'd have the legionaries, but what about the cavalry? The cavalry appeared later on in an aspect, but actually when they went into the camp, you didn't see anything of that. You didn't see anything like in the extended version of Gladiator when you go into the fabricae, the actual workshops in the camp, and see that in motion, etc. There was only one. I think it's in episode 1 and episode 6. He actually went outside the camp to talk to auxiliary units, but then that wasn't really explored in great detail. It's like there was a lot of aspects that you'd sort of think, oh, that'd be a lovely little, add a little bit of detail here and there, but actually it was again a missed opportunity.
So let me ask you this though, because I haven't seen this, and I'm assuming that this is ultimately a human drama story, and it's got to be driven by the characters, right? So it sounds like they did some reasonable efforts on the characters, the way they dress and so on. But I started off by talking about Varus, and so tell me how does this series present this Quintilius Varus? What's he made out to be?
Arrogant, I would say, is probably the best aspect of him. But I think the interesting thing is also that the villainy is not, it's Varus's commands, but in fact there's a centurion who's a much more vicious enforcer of Varus's tribute, which is how they explain the sort of growing suppression of the Germanic tribes. There's a governmental meeting of the Reichs that they have, which I kind of semi-Germanic. There's distrust between the tribes. They don't like the chatty. They call the chatty dogs. They call them the chattins rather than the chatty. But there's the Swabi, who have a different hairstyle to the Cherusci, who have a different hairstyle to another tribe. So that stuff's all very interestingly
The
And
travel
or-
times were seemed really, really short, though, considering where all these people are supposed to live.
It was no Game of Thrones 5 months to walk down the road kind of thing.
Well, the reason why they would call them the Chattons was, of course, the German is Hirose und Chatten. Chatten is how it's So I just want to say, for example, if you read your little kind of copy here of Velius Paterculus, and he sort of describes some things here. I mean, the one thing that's very clear is that he actually does not blame the Roman army, right? So he says, here I can merely lament the disaster as a whole. An army unexcelled in bravery, the first of Roman armies in discipline, in energy, and in experience in the field, through the negligence of its general, the perfidy of the enemy, and the unkindness of fortune, was surrounded nor was much opportunity as they wished to have given them the soldiers either, and it goes on. So the point is, this Roman historian who was close to sees the failure in the whole thing as the commander. So maybe the arrogance is actually true. Maybe.
Yeah, but he's coming from a different perspective in terms of supposedly, Velius Paterculus is coming from probably serving with Tiberius in the Balkans, and that's where possibly he's got that aspect, and coming into the command of somebody like Varus, who has been in the East, has been probably had a little bit of time out from actually campaigning and whatnot. Maybe there's he's got a taste for somebody else's leadership.
So plug for our good mutual friend Jona Lendering, who's excellent livius.org site. By the way, I recommend people listening or watching this go to livius.org, and there is an excellent 6 or 7 page historical summary of everything surrounding this battle. And he talks about the sources, and one thing he does mention there is that yes, the conceit is that Velius Paterculus is very much an apologist for Tiberius, but actually what he does, he has a dig. He says the people really were at fault that appointed Varus for this role, and guess who that was? That was Augustus and Tiberius. So, in a manner, that it isn't all glowing. The fact is, it's a mistake that could have been avoided, I think, and the troops were not to blame. Is really what
it couldn't be avoided, really, could it? Because you had to be part of the family to be appointed on the German frontier. I mean, if you look at it, you've got Tiberius up there, you've got Germanicus, you've got Varus.
No, that's much later.
His extended family, but
that's much later. No, we're talking 9. So, for example, Germanicus doesn't arrive till 14.
Oh no, Germanicus doesn't. But you've got Tiberius, and you've got Drusus as well. Sorry, on the German frontier.
Well, funnily enough, we don't get any of that in the series because that's way too many Roman characters to talk about.
That's a shame.
We've got Varus.
Actually, Augustus doesn't even get mentioned.
No,
what?
no. There's the eagles, and the weird obeisance to the eagles of kiss the eagle. Is a very strange thing. Steal the eagle. Very much.
So they do have a little cameo thing where an eagle gets stolen, do they?
Yeah, not even
See,
a
that's
little cameo.
historic. That's mentioned by Florus, and it's also
very strange.
That's mentioned by
Very
Florus.
strangely, they make. But then, very strangely, they make absolutely nothing in the actual battle of the 3 eagles then being captured in the battle. Yeah. They don't refer to that at all.
Yeah, it's odd. It's odd, and. Yeah, I think that there's some really lovely touches, but I think, like you pointing out, Mark, us being historians going in with that knowledge, thinking this would have been so easy to make more historically accurate, without very little additional cost. But whoever listens to the historical advisor, unfortunately, there have been several films where the historical advisor's reputation has been ruined by being the historical advisor, more than one who've then distanced themselves from the film that they were the historical advisor on because their advice wasn't listened to. So, it's a very hard role being that. And it also, it's not history. It's not nonfiction history. It's not a documentary. It's a dramatic story told within a historical context. So, for me, the interesting thing about the drawing of the villain. So in the story, the villain isn't particularly Varus. Varus actually comes out quite sympathetically when his fatherly concern for Arminius is betrayed.
Well, you better explain that to Lindsay by saying that.
I will explain that. Sergestus is much more the villain, but he's more villainous than anyone else, and yet he's not punished. He's the one who betrays the Cherusci, yet he then makes himself the Reich. You're like, he's surely, but because he's a historical character, you can't kill him off. So
footnote for the people like me who you keep using the German word Reich. What does this mean?
That's how they refer to the chiefs of each of the Germanic tribes. is the Reich, R-E-I-K, I think. And so they have a parliament of Reichs, and they talk about the Reich a lot in each tribe members, and each chieftain they talk about who's the Reich of your tribe. So
not the lighter or something, or chef. Okay,
no,
that's very interesting.
No. So the story is that when Ari, because we're pro-barbarian, which we'll get to, because that's a really interesting angle on this whole take of it. Anyone who opposes the Romans is crucified, which I don't think there's any evidence for.
There is crucifixion before this period in terms of on the German frontier when there's punishment given out to German tribesmen.
But it's interesting.
Not on this example.
That's interesting that they've twisted that, because then, of course, there's a German nationalism angle to the unification of the tribes, which is, almost literally 1854 years too early. Then there's this sort of strange idea that if the nationalism fails, they will be crucified. So there's a twist to make it like Arminius is a Christ-like figure, which was like, wow, that's a stretch. But it was interesting because what they've done there is Arminius is adopted by Varus at Rome and taught the Roman ways. It's then revealed, shock horror, dun dun dun. Actually, there were so many dun 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 moments in this series. Like every episode had like 4 of them. And anyway, the idea there is that he has raised him to be the chief of the Cherusci and be a Roman representative of his tribe and control Roman Germania that way. Poor old Arminius, of course, has believed that he's been raised as a Roman, and that the pinnacle of things that you can aim for are to be presented with an equestrian sword, which is bizarre because it's a gladius hispanensis infantry sword. No one's wearing a spatha. No one's wearing a longer cavalry sword. Oh dear. But that's okay. The swords are very nicely made, I must say, although they're a bit sharp. I don't think there's any evidence that a Roman gladius could decapitate with one blow, and that happens several times. I haven't experimented. I haven't experimented with that, or I've watched enough of Forged in Fire to know that sometimes the single blow decapitation is much harder to achieve than people might assume.
Instigator. Yeah, to your point though, Murray. I mean, the New York Times, I think, interviewed the screenplay people and the directors and the producer, and they said, I mean, there's a quote in the article which basically this is not a history lesson, this is entertainment. So I'm prepared to accept it on that level. I just think it's a shame. And somebody quoted on one of the Facebook fora that the mistake was that they seem to have pitched it as being a very, very authentic, very accurate portrayal. And then they don't do that. So really, it's not what it says on the tin.
Well, I think as with any, any costume drama, there are things we don't know. We don't know exactly what face paint the barbarians used. Like Mark was saying before we came on air, Strabo does record that there is black face paint, but the extent to which they take it with symbolism and markings. I mean, one thing this doesn't have that a lot of more modern explorations of the ancient world do have is there's no one who's excessively tattooed. Normally, when you're dealing with barbarians, there's excessive tattoos everywhere.
Maybe that's a Viking thing.
It could be, but there's also Germanic, ideas of that. So, but here we have face paint. We have black face paint, but we also have black face paint with white stripes in it. We have other colors of face paint. We've got cannibalism. I don't know what the evidence for ancient Germanic tribe cannibalism is. Again, a spoiler warning that, there's a moment in one of the episodes where, actually very near the end, where the Germanic tribes eat the testicles of one of the Romans, which is the most bizarre moments of what? Why? And it hasn't been set up earlier. There's not anything in one of the first episodes to say, oh, by the way, the Romans are cannibalistic. There is a moment where Tisnelda takes the heart out of a killed chief and swears. There's also some lovely touches of, there's lots of references to Wodan, sacrificing his right eye for divine insight, which of course ties into Germanic and later Norse mythology. There's even a binding of the eyes and going into the bog as a sacrifice several times. There's a falling on of the Varus falls on his sword, which again I'm not sure, is that Varus's end in the sources? I don't think so. So there's weird bits.
There's also the aspect of at the start they sort of pitch it as this is the battle that changed history as such, and then but throughout it, even though you sort of get the idea of Rome as this monolithic force, the German tribes are consistently shown, like the Cherusci are shown as this one village, small band of men and whatnot, and likewise with all the other tribes, it comes across as like the Romans having a small problem with a local, village and their neighbours, basically.
It's got a bit of the asterisk to Gaul about it.
That exactly, yes.
So and then of course you sort of think in the sources, of course, Arminius, his strength actually comes from his military prowess, and of course like a true Germanic warrior, the men who follow him, and his gathering of troops. And in the series, he seems to have no one until the last moment when all of a sudden he has an army.
There's sort of a hint in the series that there are a lot more troops available elsewhere, and there's talk of first a swordsman or something, sort of like there is a warrior elite.
Yeah.
Like this Falkland wolf spear guy is supposed to be part of that, but then you don't see it in anything other than that they have a huge cricket bat of the sword. And the Germanic village is indeed very asterisk like, with it's just several houses, very sort of in an open spot in the woods. It's like, so where they grow their grains, is it the little sort of herbal patch?
Well, that's the other thing in terms of the landscape.
They go to Aldi and Lidl. That's where they go. That's where all good Germans go.
With Germany, that's true. Yeah.
In terms of the landscape, of course, they go with the idea of we're in the Germanic forests, and in terms of the sources, again, if you really think about it, actually the battle didn't really take place in terms of forest. Probably in terms of, it's probably more likely in marsh or fenland. That's actually the final 10 kilometers of battle takes place, but it's still forest, and
so
even when they talk about grain, you see no fields for it.
This is the problem. So the only person who actually mentions Saltus Teutoburgiensis is Tacitus, right?
Yeah.
And he mentions that in the Return of Germanicus, looking for this battle site. And the problem is Saltus doesn't necessarily mean forest. It can be ravine, and it can mean all sorts of different things. And different historians over the ages have imposed on this kind of rather vague expression various things, right? So you'll hear often it's a Battle of Teutoburg Forest, and as an article of faith. And then when Kalkriese is discovered, and maybe if that is in fact part of this campaign or battle, the moor is absolutely an essential part of its identification, because that's part of the mythology of the. So we don't really know. And then in addition, you look at, for example, again Tacitus, but mainly Cassius Dio, and he mentions all these mountains and slippery surfaces. I mean, the landscape. In the Roman imagination, Germania is this horrible place of extremes and cold and wet and all the rest of it. And no wonder the Romans failed, because this is not where Romans are supposed to be. I wondered, did that sort of come out in the dramatic portrayal?
The series firmly puts itself in we're going to go to the Teutoburg Forest and teach these Romans who are revolting. These barbarians who are revolting a lesson.
When the Roman army was marching through the woods, there was just this beautiful, like straight as an arrow, as if somebody was going to build the autobahn there. Just fire break in the woods.
That's where the inspiration
when they
came
were going
from.
to be ambushed, they handily sort of took a left and then they went into the woods, and you go, aha, here into the woods, this is where it's going to be.
I did like the Roman column that I was looking at that scene that you're describing, and when I'm sort of thinking in my mind, a Roman column marching along, 6 men wide and whatnot, and I'm looking at this thing like 40 men abreast, sort of marching through this. It's spectacular, but
Yeah, there's some nice drone shots of that. Some of those drone shots look quite lovely.
Yeah.
But it was, but again, very peculiar that they didn't explore more of what they could have, I suppose. With all that effort into uniforms, why not give them a very brief lesson, and this is how you make a shield wall and stay that way.
So let me ask you this question. So in the Roman accounts, again, you're talking about building this layer cake from these 4 or other sources. It does not stop with this final battle that you've described to me. It goes on that, I mean, then there's this flight to Aliso, Halton, we think, right? And then there's the heroics of the Praefectus Castrorum, who's able to. Is any of that covered?
No,
that could be in the second series.
Spoiler, that's where that would be. Yeah.
We don't know.
I don't think it's going to be in the second series. The way it sort of leaves off with that. Sorry, just the spoilers here. In terms of that battle, it is pretty finite. That everybody pell-mell against each other. No formations. Everybody's over everywhere, and then you get the idea that it's over. That every Roman's been defeated, and no barbarians have fallen in the melee, and that's it. And everybody's sitting around having a barbecue afterwards. It's
we could have written such a great screenplay.
Well, no, I don't know that barbecue's quite right. I think that there was some raw meat.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, but yeah, you're right. But then weirdly, it then cuts to the head being ridden off, like something's coming, which is almost like a tacked on.
Well, throughout the entire series, you've had the reference to the brother. I would be anticipating that it has to be that the brother is brought back in when Germanicus takes revenge. But I mean, it's
have you pitched that? I think you should maybe pitch that. I think one point though is that most of the episodes had a woman director, which was very interesting. So Barbara, I can't remember the surname, and then only the final episode that I noticed had a male director. Which was interesting. The writers across the 6 episodes were the same, so that did give it a consistency, which was quite nice to see. But I don't know where they'll go. Second series, it could go anywhere really.
I've got to say, I like the portrayal of Thusnelda. Although she's sort of depicted in this series as having already married Arminius before the battle and whatnot, which seems to sort of go against the sources and whatnot. If you know your history and you know what happens to her eventually, in terms of she ends up a prisoner for life in Rome after the second campaign in Germania, I would have thought that actually for something different, they seem to sort of be following her story a lot, and I was sort of thinking actually if you want to make something really interesting and different, actually to follow her story and hone in on that, especially for a second series, would actually be an interesting, line.
That is, because in the 18th and 19th century, painters loved to paint Thusneld in the Triumph, and there's all this defiant German maiden aspect to this. It becomes part of the foundation myth of the modern Germany. That a woman, even though she's captured, can show this upright Germanness.
And again, her son ends up coming back, isn't it? That he ends up getting put in charge of the Cherusci when he's elder, isn't it? Italicus.
Right. Yes, that's right.
So again, it's sort of an interesting, and of course he's put in to sort of succeed where Arminius was failed on the Roman plan.
So ironically, the Roman historians, I think, actually knew it was a good story to tell, and there are all sorts of bit parts. I mean, for example, there's Flavus, who's the blonde-haired brother of Arminius, who there's I forget the name of the battle now, in 16, where he's very much loyal to the Romans, and the Tacitus pictures these two figures together, barbarian, renegade, and but there are all these other characters.
Actually, Lindsay, while I'm thinking of it, can I just correct myself there? Sorry, my mistake. It's not Arminius' son. Sorry, Italicus. He is Flavus' son, who actually ends up. Sorry. Keep going.
But he does have a son, because the humiliation for the Germans is that eventually Germanicus actually seizes this on this sort of hit snatch raid and takes them back. And of course, this is all in the Roman narrative. It's all part of the story building up Germanicus as a hero, because he's wearing the barbarian down, and he takes the prized assets. And even though in the end Arminius is not captured, they've got the important goods. They got the wife and they got the son and so on.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's all these other characters. I mean, there's Lucius Asprenas, who's the nephew, who plays an important role in kind of the emergency response. There's on the battle. There's Pneumonius Vala, who tries to escape. There's Caldus Callius, who commits suicide with a chain on his head. There's Chionius, who surrenders. There's Arius, who saves this eagle. There's Marcus Callius, the famous guy on the tombstone. Does he get it?
He is in it. He is in it, but not in the battle scene. He's in about episode 2. Because you can see him, because he's got his famous breastplate with all his phalari on it. Yeah. And he is, I checked in the credits, he is credited as Marcus Caelius, but you don't see him in the battle, you just see him a bit earlier on. But he is there, which is a nice touch.
So he has he's got a certain stardom. I think that's good. See, those sorts of details I think are good, because again, I think that we may be critical, but the one thing I do like about this sort of dramatization is it may pique people's interest, that they go and find out what the truth of these things is. And there really was a guy called Marcus Caelius, and if you read the tombstone, you read and learn so much.
I think him, yeah. I did see people pick up on the Calcrease face mask, but then it was worn by
Arminius himself.
Yeah. Was it? Yeah, Arminius wore it himself, but in
that's
a way
that's how he's introduced.
To be an incorrect reconstruction.
Yeah. I thought the dramatic shock of hostage exchange was a weird one. That hostage exchange was a common diplomatic step in all tribal communities. So the idea that it's this shocking sacrifice that Sergius, is it Sergius? No, what's the father's name?
Sigma.
That he makes, it's shocking that they would do hostage exchange. I thought that was a little bit weird, because it's like, well, hang on, that's a standard diplomatic procedure.
Well, and you're quite right, because there's two things that stand out on that subject. So, for example, there were hostages and they were bartered, and Augustus, when he finds out, actually bans them from entering the land of Italy, because they're considered to be cursed. And of course, this is a terrible thing. Their families negotiate to get their people back, and they're not allowed to go home, because they are turned into vile creatures. And then the other thing is also Ahenobarbus, who is actually a character who would play a role in the earlier backstory. Had a terrible reputation, because in fact he tried to negotiate for Romans who'd been captured on other occasions and just screwed it up. Again, so the Germans realized that they could actually exploit weaknesses in Roman negotiations.
If you want to take it that step further also, I mean, one of the things that's been left out of the story is that actually Segestes himself, who's sort of depicted as, of course, the father of Thusnelda, but also he's also in the historical sources, they tell us that he's lost his own son in the same process, who is, of course, ended up as a priest in Cologne, the altar of what am I trying to say? Can't think of the name of the altar.
Yes, the Ara in Acropolis in Cologne. Yeah.
Well, I suppose they do reference that they lose their son, but again, it's a Roman atrocity that makes him from he's the one who actually opens the entire series, is the son running around being boisterous and being rambunctious, and then gets bashed on the head, for which no one gets upset particularly. So there is the idea, and then he's adopted by the priestess, so perhaps that's the reference to it, and he's the one. He does have visions. He does have visions, and he is on the battlefield at the end there, which is a very visionary kind of exploration of the sort of the story, and lots of wolf imagery, that the wolf is coming, and it's not clear if the wolf is a good or positive aspect. For Arminius has visions of the wolf several times, but then the Roman Empire itself gets referred to as the wolf.
Yes, because of the Romulus and Remus story, of course.
There's there's a blurring of the line as to the wolf as a bad thing that's coming, because of course you then get the Fenrir the idea that, when Ragnarok comes, that the Fenrir the wolf will devour the world, and of course Fenrir's sons one will devour the sun and the other will devour the moon. So that story is referenced several times. So there's a weird confusion of the wolf seems to be leading Arminius to what he's doing, but he flip-flops between being loyal and being disloyal several times in the series.
And that's a shame, because I would love to know, and this is the thing that's always fascinating with ancient histories, is what is the motivation? An historical level is, why did Arminius do what he did? Because it's kind of still rather opaque. But from a dramatic point of view, they had an opportunity to make a clear case for one thing.
Oh yeah, they do. They were going to try and kill his best friend.
Which is?
They were going to try and kill his best friend, and he was given the sword to do it, and he decided, no, I'm going to kill all the Romans here instead, and that's the tipping point.
But at the same time, I don't think it's clear cut. I think he's, as you said, he flip flops back and forth on the whole thing, and he comes across, I feel, as sort of a weak character in that sense, that he doesn't come across as just defining for us exactly what his motives are.
No,
that he's indecisive. And sorry,
Wolfspear is the decisive one.
Or Thusnelda.
Well,
yeah.
It's,
I think in the end, Thusnelda comes across as sort of the
Yeah.
final thing that pushes him, but that's right at the last moment. It's like just sort of a knee-jerk reaction, and that's the last decision. But actually, he doesn't seem to have a plan the whole time.
Well, it's a real shame, because I'm sure Joe will back me up here, is the fact that, the Roman sources have a sort of sneaky respect for this guy, because, if you think about it, he actually formed an alliance amongst, 3-4 nations, tribes, and pulled this thing off. It's amazing that he did this. And that requires foresight, leadership, and charisma, and all the things that go with the leaders. So if they portrayed him as weak, I think that doesn't stack up with the historical persona at all.
Well, again, it comes out that they've spread this rumor again from Wolfspear that Thusnelda is a touched, and she does. Well, I thought she sacrificed her eye, but she kind of cuts her brow and her cheek, and then her eye gets bloodshot.
But she doesn't have any eye patch, so
she does wear the eye patch
but then she takes it off at the end.
Yeah, very weird. But that whole sort of idea that she's the one who convinces the tribes to follow Arminius, not Arminius, and that was even confused that Arminius fights the final battle in Roman uniform, whereas earlier he's posing as a Cherusci chieftain to be more Germanic, but when he becomes Germanic, he's wearing his Calicresa face mask, but then when he takes it off, it's got the line of black and white face paint. Very, very modern 21st century cool, which was very weird, and some of the face masks of the Germani, different tribes, they're wearing face masks of different kinds, which are very out of place and anachronistic. There's the antlers, which, and the deer skull.
These almost seem to be Neolithic, don't they?
Well, they're very barbarian trope. They're very, again, going back to Gladiator, very, this looks cool. And they look amazing, but there's very little evidence for what they were. Having said that, a lot of the trousers and tunics that the German tribesmen wear seem to be quite accurate. The hairstyles, the different hairstyles on the Swabi and some of the other tribes, I think.
But the irony is, historically, the Swabi weren't involved.
Well, they're certainly mentioned as a tribe.
They were,
Swabi,
but it was the Bructeri, Angrevari, and the Cherusci were the three major components.
Well, they're all mentioned. They're all mentioned. The Chapmans.
Well, the Swabi were all different. So Joe was going to try and say something. Joe, you were going to say something.
Aside from the comments of, when Arminius takes the helmet off at the start, I can't help thinking that he looks like a Roman era Terminator. His war paint on. But going back to what Lindsay was saying about kind of the Auxiliary and Arminius being this great strategist, and I think they also it doesn't really develop enough on that idea of how dangerous the Auxiliary can be if they were to turn against, because of course you take them in, and especially with the hostages, you're taking them in and you're training them hopefully to help you, but you are training them to defeat you if they should so become that way inclined, and you see it over and over again, where native uprisings are led by people who have been trained by the Romans. So particularly Tacfarinas soon after, and then you have Julius Civilis later. And it's one of those interesting things in this story about how Arminius is one of those ones who particularly shows how dangerous the Auxilia can be, because you have trained them how to defeat you should they want to, and I don't think that comes through enough. I thought it would do.
No,
There's
not at
one
all.
point, potentially spoiler here, but Arminius is sitting around a campfire with a couple of other soldiers, and they're talking about when they were ambushed during the Pannonian Revolt, and they're bonding over that, and they're discussing tactics. And I was thinking this is a brilliant way to bring up the dangers of auxiliary leaders from native tribes and then sending them back, and it just never really goes anywhere, unfortunately.
Well, it does.
The Romans would say that their most fierce, most dangerous enemies were the men that they trained themselves. And I think that it speaks to the professionalism of the Romans, that the training that they would give, the experience that a native leader in the auxiliaries could obtain was so great that not only do they have the most up-to-date training and warcraft, but also they knew exactly how a Roman army operated. And Arminius himself would have known precisely what the Varus and the Roman legions would have done as they were moving into Germanic territory. That is, he would have understood that Varus would have considered himself to be moving in friendly territory. He was not, but that if they were moving in friendly territory, they might not be as much on their guard, and that was a perfect time to strike. And just building upon that point, auxiliaries were dangerous, and one of the things that the Romans would do, not too much after this, is they would ensure that any auxiliaries who were recruited into the Roman army would not serve in their native region, that they would have to be posted somewhere far away so that they would not have some sort of
after the Batavian revolt.
Yeah, loyal feeling to their people.
And that's part, I think, of the motivation in the story that the Romans actually pick up on here, is that the trigger for this is really the build up that Arminius and Zegimir actually get in, that they earn the trust of Varus, and they leverage and they exploit that, and they're able to. There's a dramatic moment when they think that thing is going to be exposed, and in fact he dismisses it, and then they're able to unleash this plot. And it's the way that barbarians trained in the Roman way of thinking can be this sort of deceptive, wily enemy within. And you're right. I think that the enemy within, the unsettling thing that these people can't really be trusted, is a message that you have to sleep with your gladius under your pillow almost, because they're not us. That they are foreign.
Arminius's coalition also presages what would occur centuries later, as the Romans, instead of facing relatively smallish tribes such as the Chatti or the Cherusci, would face confederations of these smaller tribes. So the Cherusci and others would ultimately coalesce into the group known as the Franks. And further south, you would find the Alemanni. Along the Danube, you'd have the Marcomanni. And these larger coalitions of tribes, these confederations, were much more dangerous to the Romans because of their numbers. That is, you couldn't overawe a smaller tribe with just a legion, that you would need very large deployments of troops. So, for example, this is much past our period, but Emperor Marcus Aurelius was fighting a war on the Danube against the Marcomanni for years, and he was not able to put it down for a very long time. And this coalition that Arminius was able to put together, at least temporarily, was able to deploy the kind of strength that was able to take out 3 Roman legions, which itself is an astonishing achievement. Let's, for want of a better word. That is, three out of the 28 Roman legions were destroyed over a several day period, and it tore a hole in Rome's defenses, and was such a shock, such a psychological shock, that not only did it apparently send Augustus into some panic in Rome, and thus Quintilivari Legiones Rede. But these three legions were never reformed; they were never rebuilt.
And yet we get nothing of this impact in this whole show.
That's a shame. That's
I
a
want-
real,
I just
real
wanted to-
shame.
I wanted to touch on Joe's opportunity lost around the campfire, because, of course, that dissolves into another trope, which is the tough men comparing battle scars, which I think traces back to Jaws. But there have been so many aspects since of like, oh, here's my war wound, and up comes the thing, and and this is my, and again, there's this moment of tropish comedy, because, of course, one of the wounds was in the butt. So it's kind of like, why? Okay, that's weird. But anyway, why? You could have done that. You could have, and again, possibly because we're Roman historians and we really wanted the nitty gritty. This is how we discuss it. And, we do get the drawing with the stick in the stand, another trope, really. Here's the Roman legions. Here's what we're going to do. We did get the chopping of trees and, the falling down of trees, which is possibly another prepared siege or besieging tool. But yeah, it then disintegrated into one-on-one melee, which is another common trope of yeah.
If we come back to the again, what Joe said about the auxiliaries, I think that's another thing that I hate to keep sort of complaining, but the thing that was missed was actually the motivation of the Germans in the rebellion. I mean, in the series, it sort of all comes down to this whole our kids are being taken as captives sort of thing. That seemed, and a little bit about taxes and whatnot. But actually, if we go back to the sources and look at Arminius as what he's experienced and everything, the whole idea that actually people like Arminius would actually be able to acquire service in the Roman auxiliary cause, and because they're then allies, they're going to actually get a better pay rate than if they are actually absorbed into the empire and fight as part of the empire. And issues like that might have been threshed out a little bit more, but again.
So my understanding is this, right? So the Cherusci at this point in history are not actually conquered territory; they're allies. Okay.
Yeah.
So the idea that the Zegimir actually hands over his son as a hostage is part of this treaty negotiation, right? So you keep the treaty, you get your son back, and actually the son will come back wiser, more wealthy, and so on and so on. What I think is lost in all of this is, in a sense, that this would not have been an auxiliary unit in the way that we know from 50, 60, 100 years later. I mean, this would have been a sort of a war band headed up by the war leader. In this case, it would be Arminius. And it would probably be called Arminius's Allah or something, right? And this is part of we discussed this in a previous podcast about Augustan auxiliaries and how little we really know about this whole thing. But this is a very interesting transitionary period in Roman history where the auxiliary units are sort of being expanded and being professionalized and all this sort of stuff, and some of the conditions being laid down. So it would have been really fun to explore all that. I mean, these people really exist somewhat in the periphery. I mean, they're not, as I earlier said, they're not Romans, but they're treaty allies, and they come with certain, obligations, responsibilities. But we're supposed to trust these guys,
It's hinted at in the series. They have the, as I think Murray mentioned before, the whole idea about him looking forward to receiving the gladius representing his equestrian status and whatnot. But as you're saying, I mean, the fact that Arminius does end up as an equestrian citizen of Rome, and yet is leading a warband. Fantastic to see.
I think there's one reference to the auxiliary getting 1/3 the pay of a legionary when he's convincing the auxiliary cavalry to join him, which again seems to be, well, you saw me do a bad thing when I killed the only survivor from me massacring my own unit. If you don't come with me, you'll be next, which was very, didn't appeal to any sense of nationalism or Germaniness. Just, I'll kill you. You better do as I say, which the guy does. The guy then just goes along with it, which is like, oh, well, that could have been better handled. But anyway.
So anyway, I'm hearing also some mixed sense, and I haven't watched it. I'm still not convinced I should see it. So what was the thing that stood out for each of you then? I mean, that's really they did this absolutely right. It's
Well,
worth it
I
just
think-
for that alone.
I think you said it right when, again, Gladiator was an amazing moment in Roman history because more people came to Roman history through Gladiator than we ever could have accessed through the
That's
best
true.
lecture ever given. I think this is going to be a similar situation. More people will access Roman history from watching Barbarian than we'll ever get through normal channels. If we lose some because they realize that history is not the way it was shown, so be it. But if we gain some from the people who say, I want to know what really happened, then Roman history is the winner. And that's more important than a television series getting a few things wrong. I think this one's got more things right than several attempts before it. So, even though we're nitpicking, it's still something that there are lovely touches in there that are really nice to see. But
unfortunately, the podcast that we did about the use of stirrups released this morning, so we got that fixed.
Yeah, oh, right. Well, yes, of course, we haven't mentioned the stirrup cavalry yet. Yes, there are stirrups on the cavalry.
Well, that was all down to health and
Technically,
safety, right?
you never see them, but of course, the way that they actually get off their horses would be a miracle if they could do that without some stirrups. But,
yeah, no, you do get it. I think that they've disguised them slightly, but they're certainly visible a couple of the times you see them. Unfortunately.
So we got 2 marks. Well, so what things stood out for you in the series?
I would be saying that this is the equivalent of Tacitus being rediscovered in the medieval period, and them all of a sudden saying, "Hey, the Germans were in the Romans were in Germany," and there's actually some, we've got some details about it. I think this is, a little bit of an eye opener, hopefully, for a lot of people saying, "Hey, there's actually a bit of Roman history in Northern Europe that actually we might like to pursue here." I think that's the big positive to come out of this series. It's great visually. It's the story is is captivating in terms of following it. I think it's as we've said consistently throughout this. It's just that we're sort of blighted with our I of course sat down and of course as soon as they said Thusnelda, I've got it in my mind what her story is going to be from that point on, where it's going to go, and I've got my expectations. But if I take that away, it is a good story. It's a good yarn.
I think it was an interesting choice to have the Romans speaking in Latin and not speak English or some other language. Obviously, this is a German series, but just to speak in Latin. I think that some sense of verisimilitude to show that these were two cultures that were meeting along a frontier. I mean, I think that when I think about the Romans meeting the Germans, it's a frontier story. This could very much be a Western in many ways. There's the gulf between the different peoples, linguistic, cultural. There's an expanding empire, and this was a fight along the margin.
So that tells me, as somebody who's not seen it, that really we are expected as the viewing. We're a German-speaking population, right? This is a German program. That we're seeing this through a German lens.
Yeah.
Right. So the Romans are presented as the other, as the foreign. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, the focus is on the Germans.
Certainly, by the end of the series, the last 2 episodes are certainly more from the German perspective than the Roman. The amount of, we talked about the amount of German and Latin being spoken. If you want to get down to the nitty-gritty of it, actually there's a lot more German being spoken in the last 2 episodes. The Latin fades away into the distance. They are on the opposite side of the battlefield, sort of thing. So
it's a nice touch with the German and the Latin. I think though that obviously I was watching it completely subtitled, but in the original languages, and I thought it was a nice touch that when the Romans are speaking Latin between themselves, it's subtitled straight away. But when you have the Romans and Germans communicating through an interpreter, the Latin isn't subtitled when the Roman is speaking. Only when the German is, and obviously German-speaking audiences would just understand it, or you can read the subtitles. So it puts you in that situation of understanding they can't communicate directly, and of understanding that the non-Latin speaking Germans would be just stood there having no idea what was said to them at all. I thought that was a really nice touch.
I would have to say that whoever's doing the subtitles doesn't necessarily know what the Romans are saying all the time either, because there's a couple of times that listening to the Latin, it's not what they're saying. I just gave the example before that, that there's some imperatives that are being used there that are being translated in a very, modernist phrasing of terminology where you're, literally the guy is, if you want to translate agate, it's do it, not go and get that thing over there, sort of thing. But it's good script. It's good script. Some of the vocab that they're using is interesting, and possibly not necessarily going to be your Oxford Latin course, but
or your Cambridge perhaps,
or Cambridge Latin course. Of course, Coquilius doesn't. Mind you, I did love the fact that somebody runs through shouting out in the first episode, "Where's Metellus?" We're here to see Metellus. Yeah, of course, there's always going to be a Metellus, but
there was a Roma Victrix, I think, wasn't there? Wasn't there a battle charge,
okay.
which was like a point straight at Gladiator, not saying Roma Victor.
Roma Victor,
actually saying the correct Latin of it.
Yeah.
So Jesper, what stood out for you? What did you like of it?
Oh, everything. No, I think it's kind of a cop out to say that I would agree with most of what had been said. It looked pretty good. I mean, if you turn on the what's wrong with this brain, then you see a lot of stuff that's not right. It's interesting, and hopefully it will hopefully get a lot of people interested in ancient Rome and maybe also ancient Germans. We could all stand to learn more about them, I think. And clearly, even if you do know a lot more about it, it gives you a lot of material to talk about, because we've been talking for over an hour already. And I think if we keep it up, we'll just easily talk as much as the entire series is long. So I think I'll use that as a quick bridge to say thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. And we'll talk again soon.